And live once again here from Mount Vernon. I am Doug Bradburn, the President and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. And today it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you inside the mansion into George Washington's study. Now, this is what I like to call his man cave. And in some ways, it's almost the opposite of the place that we visited last time when we looked at the new room, which was in fact a stateroom where George Washington was showing off to the public his ideas of what the young country should emulate, also its history, also his own emphasis on agriculture as a public good. Whereas this space is a private space. This is a space where George Washington did his business of the estate, conducted his private correspondence. It was the room that he got dressed in every morning with the assistance of his enslaved valet, either Billy Lee or after Billy Lee was injured, Christopher Shields, we know, would have been his enslaved valet towards the end of his life in this room, helping him get ready for the day. And he would stay in this space in the mornings when he was at Mount Vernon doing correspondence before he got ready to go out and view his field. So this was a place that he did allow other people to come into. He had personal secretaries throughout the years who worked in here. He had visiting historians who would have been working in this room when he gave them access to his papers. And others certainly would have been in this room. But this is a private space for George Washington, as this whole side of the house is private as well. So what we're going to do today is a way to walk us through, which is really one of my favorite spots in the mansion, and a spectacular place to think about the interiority of this man's mind. You know, Washington is our man of action, but in fact, he was an incredibly powerful thinking man and a reader and a correspondent. And a lot of what he did was done inside those 6 inches between his ears. Let's kind of figure that guy out a little bit as we talk today. And the way to do it is, I think, rather than me just rambling on about lessons, to help frame some of this conversation, and I think we're ready to go already. So, Matt?
So, Doug, Lisa wants to know, did Washington use the study for business and pleasure?
Lisa wants to know, did Washington use the study for business and pleasure? And yes is the answer. He did, because this was where his business could be conducted. So the business of managing the great estate at Mount Vernon, 8,000 acres at the time of his death, including a distillery, a grist mill, a fishery, including thousands of acres out west, land that he rented to other tenants, as well as land beyond that he hoped to sell to some speculators. I mean, he had, of course, a huge enslaved labor force for the time for Virginia, over 320 people or so by the time he died, who lived at Mount Vernon. And the management of this place was like running a business. On the other hand, he also used this space for his own reading and for his leisure. And in fact, I think things that were pleasing to him. It's a room filled with mementos, you know, of his past life, of his brother, a painting of his brother, of reminiscences of the war and his papers itself. So it's a place where he could be himself, where he could be alone, where he could work diligently to do the work of the estate, but also for private speculation, rumination, reading, and all those things that you do in the privacy of your own study. What else, Matt?
So Doug, Lori wants to know, was his study always used for that purpose, or did the room serve as something else during his time?
Yeah, so question, where did this room come from? When we think about the mansion house at Mount Vernon, as we've talked about in the past, George Washington inherited it from after the death of his sister-in-law and his sister-in-law's child, his brother, Lawrence. And so by the late 1750s, he inherited a house, which ended the building when he created the new room on the other end of the house. And he also created a wing on this end, which is the private end. So like the new room space, which allowed for, you know, a very high double floored room. In this case, he actually has 2 floors. So you have the study here, and then the Washington's bedchamber directly above, including a butler's closet and a private staircase. So this was the private wing of the house, which had George Washington's study, and it had the private bedchamber of George and Martha Washington. And in that light, it was not accessible from the outside. There's a door that cannot be unlocked from the outside in this end of the building. And so it really is a private space. Most of the visitors who came to Mount Vernon, as we know, he often wrote that it was like a well-resorted tavern, and the central passageway, the upstairs, his multiple bedchambers, would have been filled with people. Most of those people wouldn't have had access to this side of the building.
So Doug, Kate, what's the favorite thing to study?
Okay, Kate has asked a difficult question. What is my favorite thing about George Washington's study? Well, I think that taken as a whole, I love the idea of a private space for George Washington, who is such a public figure. You know, this is a place that he housed all of his books in this beautiful book press behind me. And by his death, he would have had 1,200 titles in a library that he built over a lifetime. And I'll talk more about that later. It's also a place that would have been chock full of stuff. I mean, we have a lot of original objects that George Washington had in this room. Many of them are some of my favorite objects here, including, you can see the portrait of Lawrence Washington on the wall. You can see the fan chair maybe directly behind me here, which is a lot of fun. I'll talk about that. But the room itself, I think, is worth considering as a whole. This would have been crammed with space. His inventory, now when anybody dies, they do an inventory of all their possessions. They go through room by room, and in Washington, inventory of what was in this house. And I've seen the transcription of the original, which is in the Fairfax County Court records. This is an official public legal document. The men that created the inventory were assigned by the court, and if they lied about what was there, they could be taken to court. They could be arrested and held for damages for lying. So the inventory is a really good source that our curators use to understand how this space was used. And it's really a treasure trove to understand George Washington. So for instance, we have a lot of his items in here, but we don't have nearly the amount that you would have seen on the day that he died. He would have had 7 guns alone in this room. He would have had 11 spyglasses or telescopes in this room. He had his globe from his presidency was in here. His incredible chair, which rotated, his revolving chair was in here, including multiple tables, stacks of maps, stacks of prints, books all over the place, japanned box that he had, his Masonic regalia inside of that. He also had multiple chests. So there's one here at my feet, which is kind of a camp chest from Washington's Revolutionary War time, which Matt will show off here. And then one of my favorite items, which I just tweeted about, George Washington's strongbox in the corner over there under the window. Hard to see, it looks small. Chest made out of slats of iron, likely dates to the early 18th century or even the late 17th century. Martha Washington actually brought that into George Washington's life when she came. And at George Washington's death, this strongbox held over 1/2 of all of his wealth. So wealth in stocks, wealth in gold, wealth in jewelry, fine gems. For instance, his Diamond Society of the Cincinnati Eagle was in that chest. Other mementos from a life worth living. I mean, an extraordinary life. And so the room is filled with those things. And in addition to that, the busts, the original Udon bust on the wall, the original Udon of Jean-Paul Jones is in here. And when we'll talk about those in time as well, I think. But they were in this space as a way for George Washington to connect with his time. There's Jean-Paul Jones. He had a great French minister of finance in Louis XVI's time who helped fund the American Revolution, as well as this incredible frieze on the wall behind me, or across from me here, which Matt is getting frustrated now. He has to show you that. But this is a bas-relief of George Washington done by Joseph Wright. That's George Washington in a laurel crown, celebrated as the great Cincinnatus again. Wright was himself trying to get a commission to create an equestrian George Washington with a laurel wreath. And he also painted George Washington from life in 1783 up in New York. And we do own that painting, you can see online as well. But this was given to George Washington by right, and it was hanging on the wall here. In the maybe we can look at some of these specific items in more detail.
So Doug, Ruth Ann has two questions. How often are all the items in the room removed and clean, and do any of the books in the room actually belong to Washington?
Great question. How often do we clean the space or remove items? First of all, we have one of the best curatorial and collections experts teams in the world, and we take care every day to make sure that the dust and debris that naturally gathers in an old house that has visitors is cleaned off of these priceless items and heirlooms, and make sure they will last for generations to come. Sometimes that requires to take items out and do special conservation on them. In fact, that's what's happening right now with our extraordinary George Washington's presidential chair. This is a chair which rotates, called the uncommon chair in our parlance here. It was based on a French gondola-style chair made in New York in 1789, and became the president on bone wheels, essentially, that allow it to turn like any kind of chair that slides back and forth. It also had casters on the bottom so you could roll it across the room. So this was the chair Washington used as president of the United States. And when we did conservation on this item, I think back in 2005 or maybe a little later, we discovered that the original leather was still on the upholstery of the chair, which makes it an incredible survivor. And it's also a tremendous chair. There's some trivia about that chair. It was also at one point in the possession of President Andrew Jackson as well. So it's a chair that's had two presidential ownerships before it ultimately came back here to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So that chair is out for conservation. So often we have to do that at times, and we're also making an exact replica of the chair, which will show up in here, and then that fragile, important chair will go permanently into our museum gallery where people can see it. Similarly, the Washington Globe, one of the great items, I think, really an understudied item, if I dare say. Maybe it's only me that understudied it. Maybe it's just because I don't know enough about it. I feel like it's understudied. But what's so incredible about the globe is here's George Washington. He becomes president of the first nation that elects their own president on this scale. And one of the first things he commissions is a globe of the world. And so we have that globe from based on what the world looked like in 1790, London made most likely, and we have it in the collection. That is in our museum because it's so fragile. But that's an interesting story too. Actually, Thomas Jefferson, when he became president, tried to get someone to come and purchase that globe at a public auction that the Washington family held of many of George Washington's items in the early 19th century, and he wasn't able to get it, which I think is extraordinary, because that globe, Jefferson would have seen that globe in cabinet meetings. He would have seen that used globe. And interestingly, it already would have been quite out of date by the early 19th century, because the map of Europe had changed so dramatically in the revolutionary crisis of their time. So here I am rambling on again. The question was, how often do we clean? We clean once a day in this room, and we make sure everything is nice and tight regularly.
So Doug, Laura wants to know, did the architecture of Mount Vernon influence the design of the White House?
Interesting question. Okay, so take us a little far afield. Did the architecture of Mount Vernon influence the design of the White House? And there are some similarities. Certainly, they're both emulating classical styles of design that were popular in their anglicized and Frenchified fashion. In this case, George Washington is responsible for helping to pick the architect of the White House, and I think in some ways you could say that is the house Washington would have loved to build here at Mount Vernon if something horrendous had happened to this place and he had to start from scratch. So it's a design that he would have approved of. In this case, so Commissioner Thompson, I think is the name. William Thompson, is that correct? That could be wrong. You can send me my error. But the architect of was also an architect he hired to create some boarding houses that he tried to and some spec houses that he built in Washington, D.C. at the time of the development. So we have a pretty good sense of what his style was like. All right, how about some questions about some of the objects in the room? What do we got, Matt?
What pieces of furniture are original to the room, if any, and how do we know whether the room was arranged this way?
Two good questions. What is original? What isn't? How was the room arranged? First of all, we don't have a really strong sense of how the room was arranged. Obviously, the book press is here. We know that. The mantle is there. So you have windows that go all the way down to the view of the river back here. And then on the other side, you've got a door to the butler's pantry and a door that exits to a little hallway between the butler's pantry and the dining room. As to how arranged. I mean, because we don't have everything in the room that he originally had, we never had to make those hard choices, like where were the multiple pine tables and walnut tables that he had, in addition to the desks that he had in this room. But some of the great items in here that are original, and I think I'm going to have to ask Matt to move the camera again, is this beautiful Aiken secretary over here against the wall. John Aiken, a Philadelphia artisan, was commissioned to create this secretary sometime in 1796-97. George Washington, therefore, was getting it made as a secretary that he would move back to Mount Vernon after the presidency. And it has a beautiful roll-top desk in it. It's sometimes called a tambour secretary. And as you can see, with the roll-top, you can have little drawers and lots of little items in there. And Washington would have used this, of course, as a bookcase, but also as a working desk to keep private papers and to maintain the flow of the estate. It's a beautiful piece. Asked John Aiken and commissions the sideboards that he puts in the new room on the other side of the house. So that's a tremendous piece that we know he would have been using, like he would have written his will. I know a will was stored in this desk under the roll top when he died. So it's incredibly important to him. I'm straightening my tie because I can see myself on the screen. So I said, well, my tie's a little askew. What other great items in here? The fan chair. Okay, so I don't know if you can get a good view of the fan chair, but basically it's like a Windsor chair that you sit in and you pump the pedals in the feet, and it makes this sort of piece of fabric, leather in this case, swing back and forth and cools the sitter. This is something that Charles Wilson Peale had designed by an instrument maker in Philadelphia, and George Washington knew Peale very well. He sat for him more than any other painter, going all the way back to his original 1772 painting and all the way up to 6 or 95, the last years of his presidency. And this fan chair Washington had, this is not an original, or this is not the original that George Washington owned, but this is an 18th century original fan chair from a Philadelphia instrument maker. And so would have been very similar. It's a favorite with the kids. We've got lots of other great items in here. There's a chest down here that has George Washington's initials engraved in a copper plate in it. This is one of George Washington's wartime chests. So during the American Revolution, this would have lots of objects in it that he carried from camp to camp. And we've also found in our archaeological digs copies of that plate, the engraved plate on top of the chest. So there were multiples of these chests with this engraving on it. And that's really extraordinary as well. The telescope that's on top of the desk over here is a original telescope, as I said, and of course you've got great views right out the windows here. Washington had surveying equipment in this room, some of which is represented in here. There's a piece of coral on his desk, which he acquired on his trip to the Caribbean, which is an interesting objet that Washington kept. And of course, I particularly enjoy the books that George Washington owned. Now, the question I didn't answer about which of these books are original to George Washington is that none of these behind me are original. These are all representations of these are all 18th century books, but they're not the ones that Washington actually owned. Those are over in our our beautiful George Washington Presidential Library, the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington, which also has a virtual tour. You can go and take a look at some of those books in situ. And I think before this, our time together is up, I do want to talk a little bit about his reading. Let's take another question.
So Doug, Kevin wants to know, if there are two desks in the room, at which desk did George Washington most likely spend most of his time?
I think this question about which desk is really hard to get at, precisely because he not only had the desks, he had multiple tables in this room. And what I see is a man with incredible varied interests that span a lot of different disciplines, using all the space in a useful way. We don't know really exactly how he worked in his own environment. There are stories that that are told about him writing correspondence for hours at a stretch. That are told by his granddaughter Nellie, that are told in a remembrance by George Washington Parke Custis. Some of which is a little romanticized, no doubt, but Washington was a disciplined worker, and I think, given the size of his correspondence, the amount of time it must have taken, because he would write his letters out in a letter book, and then he would make a fair copy of that letter. It's incredibly time-consuming, and although he did have private secretaries during the American Revolution and employed some in the 1780s, the amount of correspondence that is in his own hand, he clearly spent hours at desks in this room working hard. What do you got?
So Doug, Lynn wants to know,
I can't get my tie straight. It's very frustrating.
Could you tell me if George Washington had a British or Southern accent?
What did George Washington sound like is a wonderful question, and there are great scholars of linguistics and of the different dialects of Americans in the 18th century. And it's likely he would have had some sort of Virginia accent, not likely a British accent like you would imagine a elite British private public school university set accent. It would have been a slower drawl, more common to the mid-Atlantic region of North America. I can't emulate it, not being a great mimic myself. But we do know that those strong New York Southerners, Westerners, you can see those parodied in newspapers at the time, particularly when they're trying to make fun of someone. They want to make, for instance, in my own research, there's a moment in time where there's a lot of political anger out west in Kentucky over the Alien Sedition Acts during the Washington presidency. And there's a series of petitions that are sent from Kentucky complaining against the Alien Sedition Acts. And they use phonetics in the spelling to make you hear, if you read it, this kind of caricatured sort of Kentucky accent, so we do believe here out in the great state of Kentucky, and it's sort of written out, Kentucky, with multiple E's at the end, way to an accent that we can recognize as sort of different regional dialects even today. And so Washington certainly would have been a part of that. To be honest, we don't know, though, what he actually sounded like, but I'm sure it was awesome. And that's all I can tell you right now. What else? Any questions?
Yep. So Doug Rod wants to know how much time would President Washington have spent in his office during a typical day?
Okay, so a question about how much time Washington spent in the office in a typical day. Well, this is pretty well documented, actually, because there's so many visitors to his house that describe their time in Mount Vernon. They describe sort of a typical day. And a typical day for George Washington is to wake up upstairs in the Washington bedchamber, and he would come down here and get prepared for the day, to get dressed. His clothes would have been kept in the closet behind me. This black door that you can see behind me there is a closet that's underneath the stairs. His personal razor, so he, with the help of his enslaved valet, would get prepared for the day early before the sun was up. And at that time, he would work on his correspondence for a few hours before then he would go out onto the estate and ride around the estate, He had 8,000 acres. There's plenty of things to do and see and work on. And he would typically get back to the mansion house and change again before dinner at 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock dinners sound early for us, but not in the 18th century. That was the big meal of the day. It's when all the guests would eat together, either in the dining room or in the new room or in a large space, maybe even on the piazza outside, depending on the weather. And then Washington would spend some time after that dinner period in the study as well, working on correspondence, dealing with things that came in the time he was gone, before again rejoining the family and the guests, for evening conversation, game, music. I'm going to just cough, so look away a second. Pardon me. That's from talking too much, I think. But so we get a good sense of this room being regularly used by him throughout the day. Not only is a place that he changed, that he wrote, he would often retire here before bed to do more correspondence or some reading, which is described as well. But he also, we know, read at his bed, like we all do, read in the bed. So there are books on his bedside table when he passed away, including a brand new one that had arrived on agriculture. I think the subject of his reading is an important one I want to get to as well this hour. Matt, another question.
Yeah, Joy wants to know what was the most well-known speech or paper that was written here?
Well, I think the most important document that was written here in this space is George Washington's last will and testament, which was obviously a private document for a man who was a pain to pass on and wanted it to be done well. But it was also a very public document because George Washington, when he signs at the top of his will, it says George Washington, formerly President of the United States. It doesn't say George Washington, planter of Virginia. It is very much a recognition of him as a public figure. And he also is quite aware that this will is going to be published and circulated widely. And it is an extraordinary and very important document because of the legacy that it reveals of George Washington. And of course, the greatest thing that he does in that will is he frees all the slaves that he owned, personally. In the will, it's guaranteed in the will that they will be freed at the death of Martha Washington. The challenge for Washington had always been, as I mentioned before in conversations about slavery, is how do you free slaves that he owned in a way that's not going to separate families, because they've been intermarried between slaves that he owned illegally and ones that worked and labored at Mount Vernon owned by his family, were Martha's dower right to use during her life, but weren't owned by Martha and so couldn't be freed by Martha. And Washington clearly wasn't able to figure this out before he died, but his will enacts essentially a forced separation at the time of Martha's death, in which the 130 slaves that he owned here at Mount Vernon and another 20 that he owned down on the York River were freed at the death of Martha. And also were not just freed, but were provided for education for those youths who are under the age of 21, under their majority, where they would be trained the same way that orphans were trained in the county courts of Virginia. That is to say, they were given a trade, they were taught a trade, which allowed them to make sure that they could earn a living in their adulthood. And the other thing Washington was provide for pensions for the enslaved elderly who could no longer work. And some of these pensions were paid out into the 1840s by the Washington estate. So George Washington is imagining a future in which these formerly enslaved people would be working in this community. And it really is a crucial document. In fact, when news of his emancipation in his will got out, it was celebrated in anti-slavery circles throughout the North. In fact, the Reverend John Allen, who was the head of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, gave a stunning eulogy to George Washington, celebrating his act in his will and saying that is the last act that has now made him a figure for all Americans to celebrate. And it really is worth reading, the Reverend Allen eulogy. You can find it on our webpage or online, because I don't think it's recognized as much as people who would have loved Washington to free all the slaves in his lifetime, which he could not figure out how to do. But it is important to recognize that his will becomes an important arrow in the quiver of the anti-slavery movement, both white and black, in the North in the United States. And Washington clearly wants it to play some kind of 18th century notion that he could emulate behavior that then therefore other people would do, similar to his agricultural reforms. You know, he wanted to show how to do it here, and that would sort of trickle down into the world. It's an old-fashioned ideal of what great men are supposed to do as political agents in society. It isn't what we would consider sort of a modern way that you make political radical change. But Washington wasn't a modern man. He lived in a very different universe than us, and died, of course, in the 18th century. So I think the will is the most important item that we know was written in this space. But his correspondence itself is worth studying, and there's a lot more that was done in here.
So Doug, Gerald wants to know, can you talk about the planning of Yorktown?
Okay, so the planning of the Yorktown battle, that's an interesting question because as we know, George Washington, when he rides off in 1775 to attend the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and he rides off in uniform, as you know, because that Congress has just heard about Lexington and Concord, and that Congress is going to be asked to take over all these New England militias and really create and George the first commander-in-chief of the American Army during that Continental Congress session in July. Is it June or July? June or July of 17, I think it's June. Yeah, June like 15th or something like that, 1775. Then he goes to Boston to take over this ragtag army, and he doesn't come back to Mount Vernon again for any period of time until 1781 on the march to Yorktown. And the whole story of the march to Yorktown is fascinating because he doesn't want to attack Yorktown. He wants to attack New York. So it's a town named York, but not Yorktown. It's New York. He's obsessed with it, because he's sort of like Ahab with the white whale. He lost New York in desperate circumstances. In some cases, people, complained about his own inept leadership. I tend to disagree, given the quality of the troops that he had to lead at the time and his own intelligence network and the lack of a navy. It's very hard to see how he could have held Manhattan. Now, the actual event better. I'm going to cough again. But pardon me. I don't have a cough button. All I have is your own generous forgiveness. So anyway, New York is like this thing. He wants to figure out a way to capture it. And the great news is when the French come in, they bring in the Navy. So maybe now he has a chance. With the French Navy, he can assault Fortress New York, take it back from the British, and declare this revolution over. So it was sort of the big strategy, sort of somehow, someday we're going to get that chance. It wasn't meant to be. A great opportunity arose in 1781 when Cornwallis's army, which had been, successful in capturing South Carolina, Charleston, and then was having to march northward to really get relieved and brought away through North Carolina, where they were harried, into Virginia, where they're being decimated by malaria and smallpox and small groups that are attacking them, including Marquis de Lafayette. If the French fleet could get down to the Chesapeake and hold the British there, then the French army and the American army under Washington could get down to Yorktown and pin them in. And that's ultimately what happened. That effort was planned in multiple places. In Wethersfield, Connecticut, in the Webb House in Connecticut, which you can see online today. It's a great historic home in which you can still see the wallpaper that was on the room that George Washington slept in the Webb House, a copy of which is in my own dining room here at Mount Vernon. But also, it was also planned here at Mount Vernon. So the French army and officers joined George Washington at Mount Vernon on the way to Yorktown for 3 days in 1781, in which they would have talked about logistics, talked about the plan, and of course, final plans were made in Williamsburg and then on the scene as the siege laid itself out. As Washington knew well, although he wasn't an expert in siege warfare was very much a practice of professional engineers in the 18th century who were in this. And so he was able to use French expertise to have a perfect siege of a defended position in which different trenches would be built, and then gradually you would move closer and closer and closer until you could put the enemy in an untenable position when they would have to surrender. So once the siege began, as long as some remarkable thing didn't happen, Washington said it is as mathematical as clockwork that this siege will be a success. And the French were key to that story. And so in this room, in the study, you know, Washington would have many things to remind him of the great French support of that effort, including maps and objects and the great bust of Necker and others here. So great question about Yorktown.
So Doug, Keith would like to know, is it fair to say that American independence was solidified in that room?
Keith would like to ask whether American independence was solidified in the room that was planned. I would say yes, including Mount Vernon. I mean, the Army was here after all. And in fact, there's a wonderful marker you can see called the Rochambeau-Washington Trail, which goes from here all the way down to Yorktown. And you can follow these markers, the Great Virginia Trail System. This story is an important one of why Mount Vernon matters, because it's not only the home of Washington, it's a place where great things happened then and great things are still happening today. So absolutely, I think that Washington's planning of Yorktown should be considered as one of the great stories of our independence. What else, Matt?
So Paul would like to know, who is the man in the painting on the wall?
Okay, so why don't I step over here? Well, the lighting in here might make it a little bit challenging. I'm going to come a little closer here. Yeah, maybe that light, can you see the painting well enough? So what we have here is a painting by an unknown artist of Lawrence Washington. Lawrence Washington was hanging here in the study of George Washington at his death. They had a tremendously interesting relationship because Lawrence was many years older than George Washington. I think 17 years older. Is that correct? Or maybe it's 13 years older. Somebody can check the Google and tell me where I'm wrong. But he was essentially a father figure for George Washington after the death of their father, Augustine Washington. Now remember, George Washington's mother was different than Lawrence Washington's mother, so they're half-brothers. But half-brothers in Virginia is as close as brothers. In this environment where people die regularly at young ages, oftentimes these families are mixed and combined. In fact, Virginia is called a tangled web of cousinry. Is a way people describe the leading families of Virginia. So Lawrence is very close to George Washington. Now he doesn't grow up with him at Ferry Farm, but in Fredericksburg. But Lawrence is often has George Washington visit, and they visit Mount Vernon. So George Washington, as a young man, is visiting Lawrence here at Mount Vernon, and it's Lawrence that helps Washington get that commission early on in the Virginia regiment, so that he ultimately owes his military career to Lawrence. Now, it's therefore, they had a close connection. George Washington and Lawrence also went on a trip to Barbados together to try to cure Lawrence from tuberculosis, which didn't work. Lawrence ultimately actually went back to England, to try to cure tuberculosis, and he died when George Washington was 19 years old. So clearly Lawrence had a major impact on George Washington, not only as someone who helped him navigate what he should be training for as a young man, but also introduced him to the Fairfax family. Lawrence Washington married a daughter of Colonel William Fairfax, who lived right down the river here at Belvoir Plantation, and that family gave George Washington his start in the world. So that's Lawrence Washington by an unknown artist, but that is the original painting that was here in the room when Washington died. You have any question there, Matt?
So Joe would like to know that he remembered hearing that Martha Washington was dressed in their bedroom above and Washington dressed in his study. Was that common in an 18th century house?
Well, first off, the question of what was common with Martha Washington dressing upstairs and Washington having his space down here, what was that common in an 18th century house? There's nothing really common about the Washington home that Virginians typically lived in, whether free or enslaved in the 18th century. They had a very large house by the standards of 18th century. Virginia. But within that class of people, of the leading gentry of the colony, yes, it was very common for men and women to have separate spaces where they could keep their closet, where they could keep their bed chambers separate, because they were able, therefore, to have their personal space. They'd have their personal servants, and this is very common going back to European fashion amongst the elite leaders. So, for instance, if you go to a palace in Europe right now, you'll have rooms for the queens and rooms for the king, and into the rank of gentry as well. So that in traditional homes at a certain level of gentry rank in the Anglophone world. So I got a question here about George Washington's reading and the books here. So that's great, because I wanted to get into that a little bit. So when he died, this book press, beautiful book press, by the way, behind me, would have been filled with his own books. And in fact, the inventory lists them. Perhaps not all of them, because we're always doing research here on some books that might have been lent out and weren't here at the time that he died. But one of the reasons that inventory goes on from in transcribed pages from page 6 to page 20 of the inventory is because the long list of 1,000 or so titles of books. Books are very valuable in the 18th century. And so they have to be kept carefully. You see Washington has glass doors, protecting these books. They tend to be themselves handed down from generation to generation. Some of his books, for instance, the Lenwood Complete Surveyor that was in here, it was actually owned by William Fairfax, which I talked about last time. This would have also included his great 2 copies of Don Quixote, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. But other books on agriculture, on military science, on belles letters, the latest novels, books on travel, on geography. And what I like to think about in the context of that inner man of Washington, those 6 inches between the ears, he builds this library over a lifetime. He doesn't inherit some large library of someone else, and he never purchases some other person's big library. So each of the books in his library has a story: when he acquired it, why he might have acquired it, who gave it to him, if it was a gift, did he purchase it for a particular purpose? And I think it helps us get off a man of action, right? So here we have a guy whose father dies when he's 11 years old. He has reading, writing, arithmetic. He's going to add to that different skill sets over time, and you're going to see these skills represented in books in the library. So some of the earliest books that we own here at Mount Vernon of George Washington are books on conical mathematics, books on geography. These are things that he needed as a surveyor, as someone learning to become a surveyor. So he's earning a living as a surveyor by age 17, 18, 19. By the time he's age 21, he's a colonel of the Virginia Regiment. And so he starts acquiring books on military science, military drill, with a particular emphasis on the big Bible of the British military in the 18th century, Humphrey Bland, but also the latest books on the light infantry and guerrilla warfare, books that are going to be crucially important to him over his lifetime. Now, he doesn't read French or Spanish, so he's acquiring things in English translations. But ultimately, as he becomes a planter, he starts to acquire books on agriculture, and then he starts buying books on law, on political thought, on history, as the crisis between the colonies and the Parliament starts to heat up and become, a test of ideas as well as a test of interest. And so you see this throughout his life. He's acquiring these things over time. So it's fascinating to see a man he's clearly a lifelong learner. And we not only see it in the books that he buys and when he gets them, but we also see it in the letters that he writes to other people about what they need to be doing. So letters to the officers of the American Officer Corps in the Revolutionary War, encouraging them to practice their operations, but also to read. And he'll list a series of books they should be purchasing. And in fact, there's a great story about the American Officer Corps being tremendous readers in a Hessian officer's journal. In New Jersey, he captures a knapsack of an American officer, and opening it, he's sad that all it has in it is books. And this is kind of a much told story that the American officers carry all these books around with them, as Washington did in the field. He had mobile bookshelves that had a whole collection of books with him. So he's a great reader. You know, we don't think of him in all the great eminences of the American Revolution. You know, we've got Franklin, of course, and Jefferson, and all these others who are associated with learning and with, in fact, philosophy. We don't see Washington necessarily in that light, but in fact, he really is an Enlightenment figure who has a real interest in the latest ideas of improvement, but also believes very much that through reading, but also by doing, you can improve yourself. And he advocates that throughout his life. So I'll tell a story about the Don Quixote volumes, which are in here, which are some of the curious story to tell. Why did Cervantes Don Quixote? Well, in fact, we know that he purchased the one, which is Tobias Smollett's English language translation of Don Quixote, published in London in 1786. He purchased this in Philadelphia on the same day, September 17th, 1787, the same day that he signed the Constitution. I mean, that's really extraordinary. We know that because it's in his little account book. He kept rigorous accounts. We also have a copy of a Madrid 4 volumes, beautiful Don Quixote with engravings, and it's the finest edition of Don Quixote in the 18th century. And he acquired this one and it was in here as well. So why do we have these two? Well, we know why, because the letter exists between the ambassador of the Spanish king to the United States, Don Diego de Gardoqui, who wrote to George Washington and sent him the beautiful edition. He wrote, "Your Excellency, I enclose for you here the finest edition of Don Quixote ever made. I remember when we were together at Dr. Franklin's house in Philadelphia, and you mentioned you didn't know the great Cervantes. So here I've given you as a gift from us of the finest edition, made from the best materials, all from Spain. I only wish it was in English so you could enjoy it." But of course, Washington already had purchased a copy of Don Quixote while he was leaving Philadelphia to go back to Mount Vernon. And you can imagine how this went. I mean, here he is at a dinner party. We've all been at those parties or around people who say, "Hey, have you read such and such a book?" And you have two choices. You either pretend you read the book and kind of smile and nod and go along with it, or you say, "I don't know the book," and risk looking like a fool. And in Washington's case, he's at Dr. Franklin's house with the ambassador of Spain and all these eminent figures in Philadelphia. And yet, what do we know about Washington? He cannot tell a lie. And so he says, "I don't know, Cervantes." Everybody said, Franklin most likely says, "Well, you know what, General? There's a new edition by Smollett right there down in this Philadelphia bookshop, and you can get it at such and such a place." And George Washington buys his own copy on his way, the ride back to Mount Vernon. It tells you a lot about the man. It's a small story, but he becomes such a figure. He really was like us in many ways. And to be sure, he always tried to fill in those gaps in his own education when he found out what they were. Questions, Matt?
Yeah, so we've got, are there any secret passages located in his library or study?
Are there any secret passages in the library or study? No. Sadly, there are no secret passages in the sense that, there's like this bookcase opens up and it has a staircase going down to the Templar gold that we've been searching for since the 15th century. No, in fact, there are doors clearly marked, and I think the space that was clearly intended to be private. There are not many people who would have gotten any private secretaries. I think Colonel Humphreys in the 1780s would have been in this room quite a bit. I think others during the presidency would have been in here. Partly one reason to get the fan chair is for your secretary to sit in and stay cool while you're dictating your messages, or while they're organizing your correspondence. He, in fact, hired a series of secretaries that organized all of his correspondence from the American Revolution after the war, partly, so he's putting together his records, but also because he understood that this would be an important historical resource, and he wanted it well maintained and cared for properly. And so people would have been working in here on his behalf throughout his life in different capacities. But no secret doors, I'm afraid. At least we haven't discovered them yet.
So Doug, Sean would like to know, Washington loved timekeeping. What did he use to keep track of time in his study?
Washington loved timekeeping. What did he use to keep track of time in his study? Well, Washington owned a number of watches, and in fact, his finest gold watch was kept in the strongbox here in the room. Now, that one probably wasn't in daily use as a timepiece, but he also had some remarkable items. In fact, there's one out on the desk over here, which I don't know what you're about, but which is really great. It is a pocket sundial that was given to him by the French, and it's just a gorgeous instrument itself. This is a pocket sundial. It's no bigger than 3 inches in diameter here. Yeah, and it has a little sundial that you fold up, and you'd hold in your hand, and you would see the shadow, on the dial itself as a way to tell time. It was given to him actually by Benjamin Franklin, not by the French. But Franklin would have picked this up probably in one of those many shops in Paris when he was there as our ambassador. So the room it was filled with these kinds of extraordinary little objects that are clever and interesting, and speaks to that mind of George Washington, who was a bit of a tinkerer. I mean, he was a mechanically minded. The chair that spun that he has here. He had commissioned rolling wine glasses for his table. These 18th century were always tinkering with the latest stuff, and these kinds of useful objects, filled a special place in his heart, as it would have people like Benjamin Franklin as well. So it's a really great gift from the great Franklin to the great Washington, a pocket sundial. What an extraordinary thing.
So Ken would like to know if we could view the fireplace.
Oh, yeah, please, Matt. Let's take a good look at the fireplace here. Now, one of the things that you'll note in this room is the faux wood graining on top of the wood paneling. So it's a paneled space, but it's also painted to have more consistent wood grain to look like a more expensive wood than it actually is. This is likely pine, and it's painted to look like mahogany or some such fine wood. The mantle itself has got a beautiful granite inlay here, or stone inlay, and then a fire back with George Washington's crest on it, which we know he ordered. So it's a grand fireplace. It has the print that you can see above is a print. Sorry, not a horse, the hunt print. And George Washington was a great aficionado of English hunt style that emerged in the 18th century and spread in this region in Virginia, fox hunting, where you'd have hounds and men on horseback riding to the death of the fox. And Washington, throughout the 1780s, was an avid fox hunter. In fact, his diary is filled with both successful and failed efforts to capture the fox around here. Now, I happen to have the great honor of living here at Mount Vernon now, not in this house, of course, but in a house built for the resident superintendent of Mount Vernon back in the 1930s. And I can say that there's plenty of foxes around to populate the woods of Mount Vernon still, which no doubt the ghost of Washington illustrated by is to get them crying throughout the night. But what does the fox say? I can tell you what the fox says because I get to hear it. It sounds like someone being tormented to death. It's screaming. It's terrifying, and it's really quite remarkable. Yes, fox hunting. And I went off on a bit of a tangent there. I apologize. Matt, what else we got?
Yeah, Donald would like to know, did he invite famous guests into this room?
Did he invite famous guests into this room? I think absolutely. You would have had your Marquis de Lafayette in here. You would have had Thomas Jefferson in here. This would have been a room for private discussion between men of business, where he would often have people he was doing business with, but also those sensitive political conversations, because it isn't an area that has a lot of access to the rest of the house. It can be closed off. You can have a quiet conversation in here. Of course, he could have those conversations anywhere around his grounds as well. But I would imagine that any man of note who visited George Washington, and we have documented visitation here, would have think of James Madison as one who clearly probably was in here at the time they were talking about the deficiencies of the U.S. Constitution. In fact, Madison spent some time here before he went to Philadelphia, writing up and talking to George Washington about what their strategy would be when they went to Philadelphia to try to make sure that their plans for a stronger union that would have powers that the Articles of Confederation didn't have could be put into place. So, those are probably some of the most potent conversations that would have happened in this space. Now, I can't guarantee you that. That is my reasoned, educated guess on the way that 18th century gentlemen worked and the way that George Washington worked and how this room would have been useful in that regard, as it would have been the place where Washington kept all of his maps, the place that he kept all of his legal documents, and he wouldn't be dragging these all over the house. When the right person was there, he'd bring them out. You had multiple tables in here, and they could work together in this space.
Is there an item in the room that visitors ask about because they don't know what it was used for?
I think the items in the room that come, to people's attention are, of course, the fan chair, which is unusual. Also, there's a letter press down on the floor. There's a copy. This is an object to be used for copying letters right here on the table, where you'd write a letter out and you'd wet it and you'd crank through another letter that would make a copy of it, sort of like an 18th century Xerox machine. It wasn't perfect, but it's something that George Washington and many other people tried to use, make sure their legal and personal correspondence could be saved. But I think, again, some of the beautiful items in here that need mentioning, the Udon bust of George Washington is remarkable. I'm going to slide over here. It might not be easy for you all to see it because of the light, the backlight behind me. But this is after Udon. Now, the actual bust is in our museum. It's taken by this incredible French sculptor in 1785 right here at Mount Vernon. And that that face was considered by many of his family to be the best likeness of George Washington ever made. And the Udon bust is an extraordinary image of a man in full. Here he is, 53 years old at Mount Vernon when Udon visits him. And Udon has got commissions from the princes of Europe and all the wealthiest people around. He is the finest portrait sculptor in the world at the time, certainly in the Europhile world. To have him come all the way to this distant place, Mount Vernon, at a time when George Washington was a private citizen, to take his likeness is really an incredible thing. And it's one of the objects that was here with the mansion when the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was able to acquire it. And we have another Udon bust actually in this room, and that is of John Paul Jones, which I'll just have Matt curve around and take a quick look at. The terracotta bust John Paul Jones, which George Washington had in his study. He clearly not only was a great admirer of Jones, but very much a great celebrator of the valor of American arms and naval exploits in the Revolutionary era. But one more question, I'm afraid, is all we have for today. But you can keep sending in your questions, and we can handle them over time. Matt, what do you got?
So Matthew would like to know, how many letters would Washington write in a typical day?
Matthew asked, how many letters would George Washington write in a typical day? And I don't know the answer to that. What a great question to end on, because one of the things that's so exciting about George Washington is the research opportunities that are open for people. There are many things we don't know. There are many queries that haven't been really pitched in that way. You probably would have to pick a certain period of his life and take a look at it. Go ahead and look at the Papers of George Washington project at the University of Virginia, and also online right through Mount Vernon. An incredible collection of every letter that George Washington wrote and every letter that he received. Now, that Papers project is really extraordinary because it's been going on in collaboration between the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, the University of Virginia, the National Historic Public Records and Archives, since 1968, with a lot of private funding as well. And they have not yet finished transcribing and annotating all the letters in Washington's extraordinary correspondence. So to get to your question, how many did he write per day? Well, he wrote a lot more per day during the American Revolution than he did for instance, in the period between the Revolution and the Constitutional Convention. So they divide up his life into the colonial period, the Revolutionary period, the Confederation period, because it's under the Articles of Confederation, 1783 until 1789 or 87 maybe. I guess probably 89 when he becomes president. Then there's a presidential period, and then there's the retirement period, which is a couple of years. And they're mostly done with almost the exception, they're just finishing the presidency period, and they're still not close to finishing the Revolutionary War period. So the most letters he wrote per day ever in his life was during the Revolutionary War period. But of course, he did that during a time when he had lots of aides de camp and clerks. So oftentimes he's dictating a letter, or he's Alexander Hamilton, write a letter to Colonel Woodford in Virginia and make sure that they have gotten the recent supply from that we sent down from Philadelphia or whatever. And Hamilton would just write out the order in his own way, and Washington would sign it and send it off. In other times, in the 1780s, most of his correspondence is written by him alone. And in that case, you could see more of a normal pace of a life as a planter and as a man who has a big following and a big correspondence, but isn't running the presidency or running the Revolutionary War effort. Similarly, during the presidency, you have another big volume of letters, many of which are official correspondence, appointments, and things like that are managed by secretaries, but many others that are personal and political letters that are things that Washington, is doing himself. So it's a fascinating question, and one that doesn't have an easy answer to it, as you see. But the information is out there for the eager researcher to put a finer story on that in our resources and see what you can find. So thank you so much again for being with me here in one of my favorite spaces at George Washington's Mount Vernon, George Washington Study. Go ahead and look online to see all about this great estate and all about the work we're doing here. I encourage you to share our resources with those you know who'd be interested in them. Subscribe to our different channels, like our different products, and continue to remember you too can always become a member of Mount Vernon by joining us in membership during this very challenging time. We're all going to get through it together, and I hope these resources are useful for you. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Doug Bradburn at George Washington's Mount Vernon.